So welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar on online communication and counseling with youth. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à notre webinaire sur communication et counseling en ligne avec les jeunes. My name is Shalini Lal, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar that will be presented by Gayle Browne from Kids Help Phone, whom I will have the pleasure of introducing in more detail shortly. Mon nom est Shalini Lal et je serai la modératrice pour le webinaire d'aujourd'hui, présenté par Gayle Browne de Jeunesse J'écoute, duquel je vais parler plus en détail sous peu. So in terms of logistics for today, I just wanted to let you know that the links to the slides in both English and in French are available here through the GoToMeeting platform. And so you can click on the links in the chat area if for any reason you want to access the slides. And they will also be available on the Access Open Minds website once we've completed the webinar. I'd also like to let you know that we've allocated 90 minutes for this webinar, and the webinar will be recorded and will also be available through the Access Open Minds website. Les diapositives en anglais et en français sont disponibles sur le site web Accès Esprit Ouvert et aussi à ce moment-là disponibles sur le côté chat du GoToMeeting platform. Le webinaire sera enregistré et disponible sur le même web de Accès Esprit Ouvert aussi. So I wanted to just take a few minutes. Oh yeah, just those of you just signing on, if you could just mute your would be great. Yeah, just if anybody has signed on, for example, please are might be able to mute them.
How do you mute yourself?
They're all muted. Oh, but maybe on the phone we have to do them. No, I think it should be good now. Okay, good. Sounds good. Okay, so to continue, there we go. Thank you. So I wanted to start off by saying that this webinar is inspired through the work we have done on the PRISM Access Open Minds project. And for those of you who are not familiar, PRISM stands for Pathway for Rapid Internet-Based Self-Referral to Mental Health Services for Youth, or Parcours d'autoréférence rapide via Internet Service en santé mentale jeunesse. And this is a project that aims to develop and pilot test an online referral pathway so that youth can refer themselves directly to a youth mental health care team located in their community. And it also provides the option for caregivers and service providers to make a referral for a young person. The pathway consists of a secured web portal to assist clinicians in triaging and tracking referrals. And this project will provide us with a foundation for providing access to tailored online resources and supports that are integrated into the package of services that are delivered by youth mental health care teams in the near future. So without going too much into the details about this project, as that's not the core focus of today, I want to just end off by saying that the mission of the PRISM project is to advance the use of technology to improve access to mental health services, and also to promote the use of technology to communicate and engage with youth, especially during their initial stages of seeking mental health services. Now, this is important because some young people may be less inclined or even unable to take those first steps in seeking help in person, for example, through walking into a youth space, due to a range of different types of obstacles. And technology can help us to unlock some of those barriers for them. So we thought it could be important for clinicians to have some knowledge on the factors to consider when communicating with youth using online technologies, and we incorporated this into the training package for the PRISM project. We also thought that it could be good to open up this webinar to a larger audience so that others working with youth or those aspiring to work with youth could also learn and exchange on this topic with us today. So before we begin, I would like to thank members of the Youth Mental Health and Technology Lab who work on the PRISM project, as well as the Access Open Minds Central Office team and our funders, the Graham Beck Foundation and CIHR, in helping to bring this webinar to fruition. And now, without further ado, I have had the great pleasure of collaborating with members of the Kids Help Phone team in the planning of the content of the webinar today, and particularly with Gayle Browne, who will be our presenter. Gayle Browne has been working with children and youth for over 25 years. Her social work career began back in the late 1990s after graduating from Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. She has experience working as a social work in the community, and since 2000, Gayle has been working at Kids Help Phone, first as a counselor, then as a clinical practice specialist, and now as a manager of training and education. Her team develops and leads clinical training and support activities for all of the Kids Help Phone counselors across Canada. Gayle is also a mom, a cat owner, and a taco lover. Today, Gayle will be sharing her knowledge on communicating and connecting with young people online through text and the various challenges and strengths to consider during this process. So thank you very much, Gayle, for being with us here today, and over to you.
All right, thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. I think you know, there's never a time now where I need to really give much rationale why working this way with young people is important. So I think I'm just going to make sure you guys can see what I'm doing here. Let's see. Let me just make sure. So, slideshow. All right, guys. Okay. Can everyone see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I want to do really is be able to talk to sort of what it's like and some of the lessons we've learned working with young people in a not face-to-face way. So Kids Help Phone obviously started as a phone line. And so it's always been about being where young people are at, like meeting them where they're at, using the technology that they used. And 30 years ago when we started, that technology was telephones. That has clearly evolved. Our phone services are still a large part of the service that we offer. But we've always had some web-based work happening for many, many years. So probably about 15 years ago, we had on our website, we had something called Ask Us Online, which was more of a forum where young people would write into us and sort of write a letter to a counselor, and we would respond to them and put it live on the web. So that was sort of how we began working with young people digitally first. I'm just noticing it says October on my screen here. Sorry, I didn't update that first slide. So that was sort of the beginning of it. And what evolved after that, through much learning and much consideration around how it is that young people were responding to us, and sort of what we do here is counseling. Everyone that works here is a professional counselor. So we wanted really that back and forth interaction for counseling. So that sort of led us into what we currently have, which is a chat sort of messenger-based model, right? So kids are writing in and it's live communication back and forth. And so I guess really I've been at Kids Help Phone for 20 years now. So I've really seen that transition. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we've learned. So I'm happy to be here today. Thank you, to share some of those lessons and sort of take you through, I think it's really about how to connect. Like, I think what we've really learned is that it's not just the same as like doing counseling on the phone or in person and just say the same thing online. It's not the same. There's a different nuance, there's a different pace, and there are definitely some sort of tricks and ways that we've learned to sort of be able to build that rapport and to make that connection. So I'll take you through the slides. I'll introduce some things. I think maybe what would make the most sense is for us to do a Q&A at, you know, just sort of open it up to you guys at the end for questions or whatever. So maybe I'll just continue on through the slides, and if people are really needing me to stop, slow down, ask a question, you can always interrupt me, please. So let's see if I can make this happen. Right here. There we go. So just a few learning goals. So this is basically often when I do all myself and my team do all of the training of the new counselors when they start at Kids Help Phone, and part of that training is obviously our clinical model, and then part of it is the technology, and part of it is phone counseling and web-based counseling, right? So we have some skills in that. So I've sort of taken what we do with our new counselors and reshaped it a little bit and worked with it for us to go through today. So these are very similar to sort of the learning goals that we would have with our counselors as well. I think it's, you know, insight into why it's beneficial. I think that there's lots of reasons. I mean, just access itself, and lots of different kinds of access. There's definitely unique challenges. Communicating empathy and warmth is, I think, a large part of the battle with online work. And then some considerations around languages and also repairing ruptures. We definitely have found that there's a way to do that, and that needs to happen. And so I'll go through all of these things, and hopefully by the end of my little presentation, you'll have a clearer sense of these things. All right. So online support. I'm just going to see if I can close a window here or move it. Sorry, guys. Oops. Yes, there we go. All right, now I have my screen. Okay, so for various reasons, obviously people choose to reach out through online. Okay, so they're all listed here. I probably don't need to go through them. Most of them make sense. What we found at Kids Help Phone, a lot of what we're doing is connecting with people in between appointments, right? Because it's a 24-hour service, so it's accessible when they're home, when they're, you know, away from their regular supports, in between appointments. And also, like Shalini said, it's often that beginning phase where, you know, walking into an office or, you know, going to see someone or even knowing how to make that appointment is a challenge. And so being available is definitely helpful for obviously reaching out. So we want to be able to support our clients without seeing them, which presents a unique challenge. So, you know, when we were doing phone counseling, I still think, you know, even though it wasn't in-person counseling, we still got a lot of cues and a lot of different ways to communicate empathy that wasn't through language. You still feel a connection, right? You're still hearing someone and they're hearing you. So I think in general, some of the like overarching things that I would say we've learned is that it's really about paying close attention to what people are saying, what they're not saying, how they're saying it. And then we really fall back on our, you know, pillar of counseling at Kids Help Phone, which is our position of curiosity. So staying really out of the expert role and really being curious. So asking a lot of questions, being curious about all kinds of things, and really being extra careful not to make assumptions, because there's lots of room for assumptions, as we all know, with online messaging. This is sort of, for me, the most important phase, I would say, because for me, because we're often at Kids Help Phone single session, the beginning and how we connect right away is very important, and it definitely sets the stage. So in terms of information gathering at that beginning, I just sort of broke this slide down so we could get an appreciation of, like, you know, in person, all of the information that we're getting just by seeing with someone and just by sitting there or seeing them in our office or having them walk in to be with us. And then all of the smaller next circle is sort of what we lose when it's more telephone counseling, right? So tone of voice and pacing, those are the things we still have. And then looking at really what we have with online texting and, you know, chat counseling are words, vocabulary, emojis, pacing, and levels of engagement. Like, those are sort of the highlights of things that we really want to pay attention to when we're doing this work online. So attention and attentiveness, and it sounds obvious, like it sounds like, of course, we're going to pay attention to our clients. However, I think it's really easy. I think some of the habits that we get into, because we spend so much time online in our personal lives and in other ways, the boundaries are different, and I think we feel a different level of ability to multitask when we're online. And sometimes the temptation is to do that also when we're working, right? When we're doing our counseling sessions. So I think it's still really important for people to try and maintain some of those same boundaries while they're doing this kind of work. People can't necessarily see you. So, I think it's okay to be in your PJs if you want, if that makes you more comfortable. However, it's probably not okay to have your kids running around or have your partner right next to you and those things. So I know that sounds maybe obvious, but sometimes it's not, especially if we're working from home. The temptation can be there, and that can really pull our attention away, obviously. So once we're sort of doing that and we're in a place where we're, focused and doing our work, some of the things really that we can then draw our attention to specifically in the work are things like spelling, capitalization, punctuation, vocabulary. Username is a really important one for how we work. I'm not sure if you would always be getting a username, but sometimes it can really give us a lot of information about a person and something to ask about. Gender, culture identity, language skills, mood, emoticons, those are all things that you can be watching for in the actual language, in the words that they're writing back to you. So as I said before, it can be easy to become distracted for both parties. And I think transparency is really key. And certainly one of the things that we always ask about as counselors, and we've learned this because of the answers that we get back from young people, is sort of if their level of engagement changes. So if suddenly you're talking with someone and they've disappeared or they're not responding, that asking about that and wondering about what that's about and not making assumptions about it can be really fruitful, because it's there's just lots of reasons why people disconnect or they change their pacing. And so it's just sort of something to check in around. It can be emotions, it could be someone else is in the room, it could be they have to leave. All of those kinds of things are possible. So it's something we definitely always ask about. I think that, when we're working with people online, there are still contextual clues and cues, but they're just different. So they're not the ones that we're used to looking for and sort of intuitively feeling. And I do think that once you're doing this work for a while and you're connecting with people this way, your intuition does sort of start to come back in that field as well, and you will start to have senses of like, oh, I wonder why that's happening. And when you start to think that, ask about it, right? Be transparent. But of course, we do have a much less cues than if somebody was right in front of us. So, I think it's always really helpful to deliberately inquire about things. And I think for me now, it gets helpful after all of these years and doing this work for a very long time. I sort of firmly believe there's a way to ask any question. So even though you might feel like you're asking a lot of questions, it's okay to maybe just, again, be transparent about that and say, I don't have a lot of contextual cues and I don't know a lot about sort of where you are and what's going on around you. So I may have to ask sort of a bunch of questions just to get a sense of that. And usually with young people or with anybody, once they know why you're asking those questions and they have a sense of why it is, then they're fine with it, right? I might just sometimes ask a really open-ended question, like, when we're connecting or when we're talking, like, tell me about where you are or tell me what was going on around you, to sort of get a sense of where they're at and where they're and how comfortable they are in the current situation. Like, we also sometimes connect with young people on their phones, right? So they could be anywhere. They could be on buses and subway stations, wherever, outdoors. So having some of that information can be really handy. So again, it forces us to be more curious and to ask more questions. And in this, if we do it again in a way that's transparent, then it can often lead to greater insight and sort of a deeper connection. One of the things I'll say for sure that I have seen since we've been training people in this kind of work for the last I've been doing it probably about 7 or 8 years. I have to do less and less of the training, because more and more people are just very comfortable communicating this way, right? Like when we first started doing it, certainly with the age of the counselors that we had, they weren't necessarily, you know, growing up texting and communicating online as much as people are now. So we had a much sort of steeper learning curve with that cohort, because they weren't comfortable, right? It wasn't a way they were used to communicating. So it was very formal. Writing felt very formal to people. And they were writing big, huge sentences and big like paragraphs back to people, and it just sort of didn't make a lot of sense. So now I find, and I don't know the sort of age group largely right now that I'm talking to, but people are in general are more comfortable online. The young people who are connecting with us in this way were always comfortable communicating about a great variety of things, and even about emotions. Like I think from a counseling perspective, we were unsure at the beginning if, you know, this was going to be a place where people would open up and be able to talk about deeper feelings or trauma or suicide and really, you know, the heavy topics. And of course, now that we've been doing it, that's actually most of the contacts that we get through chat are often the heavier topics. So the people that are feeling the least able to reach out for various reasons are communicating in this way, likely because it feels safe and it feels less risky, right? And they can just sort of test the waters, reach out, see what it's like without risk to themselves. Yeah, so these are the kinds of questions that you're seeing popping up here now. That is a way that some of the wonderful questions that we use a lot of that sort of give us, it casts a wide net about contextual cues and about information. And I think these kinds of questions are going to be, you know, a really good tool as you connect with people online, because it puts the onus back on them to sort of bring to you what's important to them. We don't have to ask a whole bunch of short, closed-ended questions to get there. We can just sort of ask that. So you've talked about the problem with them a little bit. Maybe you have a sense of like why they're reaching out. Always, is there anything else? Like what else do I need to know about you to understand the problem, to understand you, to understand what you need? Any of those kinds of big open-ended questions are going to be really helpful. So then there's just some examples there, and you'll have these in the PowerPoint. We also, a lot of our counselors have sort of their own Word documents that they have some of their own tailored questions saved in. So they come up with ways that the questions they like to ask, and then they save them, right? Instead of, so, and they might just, you know, you can tailor them a little bit to your style then. And I think that's great. Like if you have questions that work really well for you and they tend to get at like the core of the information, those are handy to have. Yeah. So we'll move on a little bit to language. Oops. So the tone in online communication is ambiguous at best. And I'm sure we can all think of examples when, you know, even the person that you're the closest to has sent you a text message and suddenly you're like, well, why did they say that way? Of course it's going to happen, right? Because we don't know. And the interesting thing is, once again, depending on the mood we're in and how we're feeling, that we can just see that text as ambivalent or as innocuous, sorry, or we can take it in a certain way. And of course, we're projecting our own feelings onto the ambiguous tone, right? And it's just important to think about, I think, that the people and the young people that we're connecting with this way are often coming to us when they're distressed, upset, they're struggling with something. So they're maybe not in the most, you know, they're not in the most positive space they've been in ever. So if they're going to project onto a seemingly neutral statement, it's probably going to be in a negative way. Like they're probably maybe going to worry about it, take offense at it, wonder about what you mean. So there may be some sensitivity around that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we change the question totally, but it gives us some insight into sort of maybe what comes back. Because I think what we found, our experience was that with counselors, when we first started doing chat counseling, was that young people would say to us, like, it was almost like they were defensive right away. There was a lot of like, why are you asking that? I don't understand. And the interesting thing was counselors were asking the exact same questions that they were asking on the phones, but they were doing it online. The difference is, if you're on the phone, you know, I can say to you like, oh, you know, even if I just said something like, oh, just wow, tell me more about that. You hear in my tone that I'm interested, that I'm curious, that I'm caring, and that I want to hear more. If I type on a screen, tell me more about that, it just looks black and white and can look really cold. And, you know, to the point where sometimes kids and young people will ask if they're talking to a robot. Because they don't know, right? And there are bots that answer questions online, so sometimes they're wondering, like, is this a bot? So, you know, we quickly had to sort of look at how we build empathy and tone and support into our language, because it's not just there in a neutral statement. Those can look all kinds of different ways to young people. So just as an example, and we sort of, when we do this live with people, we get them to sort of read them out in different tones, but just maybe look at them in your own head. Okay, there we go. Okay. So they're neutral, but, you know, obviously they can be read in a positive, neutral, negative way. So just to sort of keep that in mind, depending on current emotions or past experiences, what's going to be sort of projected onto that statement. How to clarify it, be transparent about why you're asking the question. You know, you can do it in brackets, you can do it in, like, you can say prior to asking the question, you know, here's what's going on in my head, or here's what I'm thinking, this is where this question's coming from. Often I would just sometimes say, I would ask a question and then say, you know, I'm asking because, and that was simply just so they knew, and it clarifies where you're coming from. So remaining curious, ask about things we don't understand. Again, just not making assumptions. I think the other thing is that I think with online work, I probably almost never make statements. I'm always asking questions, because I think they just, you know, unless it's something really straightforward, it can just get taken in such an unusual or different way than I meant it. Check your work. So sometimes just even like rereading before hitting enter. I know it's really, that sounds trite, but it's definitely can, when you look back over it, I think things like, you know, missing things or spelling mistakes or different ways to, when you're communicating with someone, it can just be, you're communicating respect for them by checking that, I think. Although I will say that my spelling personally was always atrocious. So when I don't have spell check, when I'm on chat, so when I was a counselor, I would often have to use humor and build rapport around my spelling mistakes. So you can definitely recover from it. But I think, you know, it is just respectful to sort of make sure that what you're sending is professional and you know, clear, and free of any of those kinds of mistakes. So emotional bracketing I have there, and that's something that I sort of talked about a little bit, and I'll go into it a bit more. And it's a technique that a lot of our counselors use. And I'm doing it in that sentence. So when I say, I know it sounds strange, but we'll talk about it later, that's emotional bracketing. So what I'm doing is sort of just putting a break around like a thought or an idea as opposed to the sentence that I'm using. And it's just a way of, it really breaks up the text when you're talking with someone, and just gives them some insight into where you're coming from. Style points, so tailor your language to your client. I mean, I think we hopefully do that in person as well. We're going to refer to like any of the information that you have from forms or paperwork that you had prior. I think you want to have that and be able to refer to it, like using, I don't know, their preferred names, or talking about, you know, whatever it is, the information that you have is it's always really, really nice when you're meeting with someone that you have that already and that you're able to use it in that meeting. It's a much more welcoming way to start the process, right? So always being mindful of different reading and writing skills. And I think you can tailor your approach to what you're getting back. So once someone is communicating with you, yeah, like you want to just keep an eye on that you're matching sort of where they are. Use your empathy, a nice little heart there. And I'll say that with emojis, I know it can feel silly to some people, and I don't think we use a ton of them, but we definitely use like sad faces and happy faces at times because it can soften sentences and just let them know how you're feeling about what you're writing or what they're saying. So we do use them. I don't think you have to if you really feel that it's unprofessional. But when you're working with this population in particular, it can be helpful. I would say a really good one to stick to is one question at a time. Maybe 2 parts to it, but I would say stick to one question. Like it's a lot of, there's a lot of you want to get as much information specifically at a time, because otherwise things get missed. If they're answering a bunch of questions, stuff gets lost in there and it can just be really confusing. Words and phrases, keep them simple, and I think also even just the ideas that you're presenting, keep it simple. So there's not a lot of, I find that it's less, what's been perceived as less helpful from our clients has been, if we're offering a lot of psychoeducation through text and through our chat service, they just like, it's too long, didn't read, like they're not interested in hearing it that way. So just to keep that in mind, like if there's an option for face-to-face for that kind of thing, that might work better. Sometimes we have to share information that way, but it could also be more helpful if you can maybe provide the links that they can check out instead of just really giving them large pieces of information to read. So I think as keeping it simple, really, like keeping it in the realm of things that that are digestible at that time, and really keeping it as simple as you can. So and this is something we sort of do live, and I think it's a good exercise in terms of what I'm talking about. So this might be how you would talk to someone. So if I was saying to you, I'll just read it so you can get a sense of like how a counselor would say it if you were live. So just listening to you, I'm wondering, you mentioned some stuff about kind of like wanting your grandmother to be more involved in your life, like on a day-to-day basis. Do you think that's something she knows about? How do you feel about her, not being in your life much in the past, and asking her, is that something you would consider doing? So you might say a sentence like that live. It doesn't really translate into reading. It sounds chunky. It sounds like messy and sort of confusing. Like, and you're asking a bunch of questions. They don't really know what you're asking. So a response, keeping it simple, keeping it succinct, would be more something like what's written here. Straightforward, right? So instead of like flowering it up with a lot of words, you want to ask the questions just succinctly. Also, just a note around professionalism. And again, I think it just depends on sort of how we're used to communicating online. We definitely have counselors who now are, say, in their early 20s, who come from a long, growing up online and communicating online, and have, language skills. It's like a different language, really. It can be. And so there's a lot of ways to do that just the boundaries aren't there for a professional relationship, right? And so we don't want to be seen as people that are their friends or their family. It's a different relationship that we have. So just being mindful that those kinds of things can create that confusion if we're not mindful of them. So we want to create the warm conversational tone. And then you'll see I use some emotional bracketing there. We want to do that without being overly familiar, right? Without obviously using pet names or even, slang or even acronyms and things like that sort of just can be too familiar and seem too friend-like, and it can just influence the boundaries we've found. and made things more confusing for counselors and for clients, I think. So yeah, sort of an example of a sentence we might use. I'll talk a little bit about acronyms and slang and emojis, emoticons. They are things that get used for sure. And off the top of your head, I don't know if people know what these are. I don't. And I certainly have had to look them up. Although interestingly, when looking them up, you will still often get it wrong. So I think the quick and easy answer for acronyms, if people are using them, is to ask what they mean by them. Because otherwise you can get into situations where you're both really referring to different things and nobody knows. So those can be funny situations, but they can also end up being disturbing situations. So I think my rule of thumb is that if people are using, I mean, besides LOL, maybe, because I think we all know what that means, but maybe not. So if people are asking about something, it's also an easy way to build rapport, right? And to sort of check in around language. So it's okay to say like, hey, you know, I don't know what that means. Let me know what that means. So I think anytime that we can open that up, it's good. So it's easy to ask. These are also some of the new-ish to me. Feel free to look these up after. I won't go through them. But we work with the population we work with are mostly under 29. So we have quite a collection of acronyms and slang that we keep sort of a live list of it, but it's, as you can imagine, ever evolving. So, and then some emojis, happy, sad, no mouth, big laughing mouth, that sort of expression. All things that are, you know, I think let people know it's actually like an emotional bracketing through an emoticon. Like emotional bracketing is basically using emojis, but you're putting words in that bracket instead of like just a happy or sad face. So it really is a way of sort of bringing you into the conversation. Because for people that are connecting with us online or through texting, and I've left these in here just so you can see them because they're kind of funny, but it gives you the idea, right? But I think what happens is what we've heard from our clients is that they don't know who we are. Like they don't feel connected to us. They don't have any way of knowing, you know, if we're a robot or not. So any way that you can bring yourself into the conversation. So some of the ways I would use emotional bracketing would be things like, you know, in brackets, I would put like, I'm really happy about that. And in brackets, I would say jumping up and down. So that sort of gives them an idea, right? Of like, it makes them picture a person jumping up and down. It makes me a live person. Or I would say something like, I'm really worried about you. And then in brackets, I would say, you know, I'm leaning into my computer or head in my hands or something like that. So it describes sort of me for a second so that they can see, they get to picture sort of the person that's they're with. Creating warmth online can be really challenging. And basically we have to use our language, right? So it's usually conveyed, obviously, face-to-face through things like body language, facial expression, tone of voice, and what you say. The difficult part online is that emotional nuance, it's hard to articulate through text, right? So we have to be mindful to deliberately communicate warmth. It's something that we are continuously working on with our counselors, is being mindful of doing this, because it can feel very verbose, for lack of a better word. It can feel really like you're laying it on kind of thick. However, you're not. I mean, I think that, you know, very neutral statements can be interpreted negatively. So I like to keep things always in some feeling words so that people are getting the warmth coming across. So there's an example here that you can read for yourself. I won't read through it. Just keeping an eye on the time. Maybe I'll let you read it, but you can see, you can feel the warmth that the counselor has in this, and it's through a lot of things. It's through things like saying, that's true, the first day of school. So they're summarizing what they're saying, but they're using things like and tell me and and dot, dot, dot. And all those things actually break up that text and help people feel a little more connected. So you want to acknowledge the feelings always, and any emotions that they're talking about at all, you definitely want to bring them up and ask about them specifically and use the words that they're using. Staying in feelings and staying in emotions is definitely a challenge for counselors when they're not face to face. So, staying with the feelings especially when the client's bringing them up, is really important. And if we're not sort of couching things in emotions, what can happen is that we sound cold and disconnected or irritated, and that's direct feedback from kids, that's how it's seen and that's how they feel. So yeah, again, you can use emoticons to do that. I think the vocalizations are really important. It just sort of makes you a person. And I read a lot of digital work from counselors, and the chats that have the connections and that have a lot of the vocalizations and a lot of that kind of language, it's leaps and bounds in terms of the rapport that's built. So it's easier to do that way for sure. So, I mean, warmth and empathy, you're communicating your empathy through your warmth, right? But, and really what we really want to make sure that we're doing it deliberately and checking in around the things that we think we understand. So, okay, and you can see here, so I'm curious. So it's always sort of, instead of just asking the question straight out, there's just sort of a softener, like something that sort of helps it just couch it a little bit. It makes it seem a little more straightforward. Yeah, so these are just some of the ways, and I'll let you sort of look at them on the PowerPoint, or you'll have the slides. So paraphrasing, reflecting back, always using their same words, making explicit in our conversation certain aspects of non-verbal communication, right? So that's that and ahas, emojis, but also the emotional bracketing, okay, which directly, the way they describe it here is directly describes our empathic response inside of square brackets. And I think it's a really good one that I use a lot. So I'm feeling worried, or I'm concerned, or any of those things that I'm talking about myself, or often my thoughts, I will also put in brackets. Just again, it brings me into the conversation, and it also helps people see where I'm at. So here are some examples. And again, it's like so the first part here is more to do with the feelings you're having. Could be to explain body language, which I also think really brings you into the conversation as a person, or to add depth and nuance. And you can see, I mean, it changes just the words that you're using, right? And this doesn't have to be in a live back and forth either. If it was like a passive, like email kind of, or texting that wasn't necessarily immediately back and forth, you can still use all of these to soften up what you're writing and to sort of bring your ideas and be transparent about what you're thinking in the conversation. Yeah, I think for me, humor and personality was a big part of it, because often there would be ruptures and things that we needed to repair. And so in my brackets, I often use humor in order to repair most of those things, and to just be able to work through them and not get stuck. Yeah, so this also just, I think, a word about connecting and being yourself. I think for me, this population, certainly with young people, I could always tell when they knew that the counselor is sort of not being genuine, or sort of cheerleading, or being too sort of positive sometimes. So I would say finding your way in this kind of work and finding your voice takes practice, and it's okay to try things, but if it doesn't feel comfortable for you, if you feel like even say emotional bracketing, if it's something that you don't feel like would make much sense for you, and it feels weird, or then don't do it, because I think if we're putting ourselves and acting like, or talking like, writing like someone that we're not, then then they know that, and it doesn't feel real, and then we're going to lose the small amount of rapport that we're trying to build. So keeping things really, keeping things in a way that feel comfortable for you. I think trustworthiness really is the foundation on which all the work we do with clients is built. So if we aren't able to do that, then there's not really much point. So that's with the agency you're with, it's with you, it's with how you do your work, right? So how we present ourselves, and languages are really our only tool when we're communicating this way. So honest and accurate information. And like I said about the psychoeducation, I do find that what was more helpful for us was sort of providing links and information that they could explore on their own. What did I want to say? Providing trusted resources. Also, I think some of that work for us at Kids Help Phone is done, but if you are providing links and outside resources, really vet them and make sure that they're places that you want young people going, and that you want that it's reputable places with good information, because they're not always, as we know, and so doing that work before can be helpful, because if they go somewhere and they're reading something and it's vastly different from your values or the values that your agency holds, then they're going to lose trust in you and worry about where you're coming from. So yeah, we might only have a few opportunities to build this trust. So we want to really be sure, with a client who's coming into our office on the regular, there's lots of room to sort of sort that stuff out. That's not the case often with young people who are connecting with us in this way. It could be one time, it could be a few times, but we want to be really sure that those ways that we're connecting are that they're always trustworthy, and that we're always representing a trustworthy approach in all of our interactions. I'll say that there's going to be lots of ruptures. Do not be alarmed. People will be mad at you. They will say, "Why are you asking me that? I don't like that. I'm offended." For all kinds of reasons. Sometimes counseling is hard, and doing this work is difficult, and people don't want to hear what they're hearing. There's many, many reasons why ruptures happen, but in this kind of work, there's more of those, because things aren't always clear, and your intentions aren't always clear. So it can be mystifying to young people or people in general as to where you're coming from or what's going on. And I think people's guards are up a bit more, simply because they can't see you and they don't know you as well, and they haven't had that interaction with you necessarily. So I would say I've gotten to the point now in counseling that I actually welcome ruptures when they happen. I wouldn't say I go as far as causing them, but I welcome them now, because I think for the most part, they're opportunities to build rapport, because I can take the onus on of how that rupture happened. We can explore how it happened, we can talk about it, and then we can build further rapport based on that. And even sometimes set some guidelines, like, I'm going to ask all of these questions about risk because I need to make sure that you're safe, and that's where these questions are coming from. Once we're done with those, we can talk about this or that. And so again, the transparency goes a long way. Both of you will contribute to those ruptures. Again, that's fine. It's really what you want to do is be able to know that they're happening. I think the easiest way online for me to know what's happening is people would stop interacting, or I'll just get back a lot of, like, if I ask a question, they'll just write back IDK or I don't know, or whatever, yeah, sure, those kinds of responses normally signal to me that there's been some sort of rupture and that the person's disconnecting. And so once that happens, I'll just, time out. It seems like we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. What can we do to get back on track? And then you're working together again, right? And my experience is that with young people is that almost always, almost 100% of the time, they're willing to try and get back on track with you and figure out what it is that you can do to connect again or reconnect. So yeah, I wouldn't, it can be a little bit of a dance, because sometimes it could be not live interaction. So you may have to go back and forth a bit, but I think it's worth clarifying and sort of doing the work to repair the rupture for sure. So this is just a little bit more about the ruptures. you know, obviously therapeutic relationship is important, and the client, you know, is going to all probably take some self-blame or be self-critical. But I think it's, you know, these ways that you start to identify it, and then basically we can just take on the work of repairing it. So that's sort of the cagier response to know that there's been a rupture. Sometimes it's really direct, as you can see here. So this is an example of what can happen, say, at a kid's cell phone with one of our counselors. It would just say conversation terminated, like they would just close out and they're done. So in that instance, obviously you don't have a chance, we don't have a chance to repair the rupture. If it's someone that you're working with on an ongoing basis, then you do have an opportunity. And I think it's, you know, the next type of conversation is probably a good idea to address that. And these are just some examples of how we can sort of respond, I think, and address that. Because it's okay to not be perfect. And in this work, there's a lot of, you get a lot of detail in large pieces of writing. And I think it can be really challenging to sift through without having the client with you to tell you sort of what's more or less important. So you may have to do some of that like follow-up work to really fine tune it and then find out from them what it is that they need the most from you. So yeah, I think this is just sort of the ways that we we address ruptures and ways that we can approach them. So when we're thinking about wrapping up a contact or with a young person, it can be challenging for sure. They don't want often to end the contact. It can feel very abrupt if we don't process it a little bit. And I think often there's just, if they are feeling really connected and they're able to have a pretty decent conversation, and most of our counseling sessions that we do online last, I would say, almost always at least 45 minutes to an hour, if not just over an hour. We try to keep it around a clinical hour, but it can be really challenging because there's, you know, sometimes getting to like the agreed goal for the session can take some time. And if there's risk in there, and if we're doing risk assessments, it can take even more time. So if you've done all that work and built that connection, you're feeling really connected, it can be challenging to then end the call or the chat. So, you know, I think anytime that we can, as we start to sort of get past that midway point, I use check-ins a lot to make sure that, you know, we're getting in the direction that they still want to go in. And even at the midway point for me, you know, when we're sort of moving more into like action plan, maybe I might start to use transition statements and check-ins and just like come back to like maybe the scaling question, how are you feeling now? And all of those sort of subtle things start to lead into ending the conversation. And you won't have to do that with everyone, but I think it's just, if we don't do it, it can feel abrupt. And when it feels abrupt, then it just doesn't feel great, and it can sort of shade all the work that you've done. A summary of this session is always good. I think I usually like to get them to tell me that. I often get them to tell me about takeaways, like what are they going to take away from the conversation, or what was most helpful. So just sort of ways to get them to reflect and provide some insight into the important points that are the takeaway. Obviously, if there's action or things that plans that they've made or things that they are going to do, they might be able to walk you through that again at the end. And again, the more time you take here, I think the more comfortable they are usually to end the contact and go back into their worlds. Because I think, you know, when I think about clients in our offices, we do some of that work. You know, we don't just sort of end a session like that and someone's out the door. Like there's definitely a wind down. And if we don't sort of prepare them for that, it can feel really abrupt. And ultimately, when they end the conversation with you, they're back in, usually alone, and in their own world again, very abruptly. So sort of bridging between us and ending the conversation is also important. Some of that can be the review of what they're going to do. They're going to confirm the plan and talk about those things. But also just, I always would say, you know, what I would always often ask just what they were going to do when the contact ended, like what their plan was for the rest of the night or the rest of the day. And it was just sort of a little way to bridge between having this, you know, intense conversation with me to going back into their own world. So, you know, with me, they would sort of talk about what they were going to do when we disconnected and tell me a little bit about it. And in a way, it sort of brings us with them a little bit when they go back into their world. You know, they remember what it is they told me, and they're able to then go on and be in their own world. I think most of, and I'm almost done, I think most of what I've learned about doing this kind of work, honestly, is about just being very, very curious, being very transparent about what I'm doing and why, and always using, I like to call it a chat sandwich. And so what that is I always sort of would address the emotion at the beginning of a question that I'm asking, ask the question, and then maybe do an emotional bracket, an emoji, or a ... at the end. And that was sort of my style of asking most of the questions that I did online. All right, I think I'm done. If people have questions, I'm happy to do that. I don't know if there's a plan for right now, if people just want to jump in and ask me things.
Oh yeah, I think we definitely have time. Thank you very much, Gayle, for that wonderful presentation. So yeah, we've got time for questions. We reserved a 90-minute seminar, so we're at 1:02. So people feel free to, you know, share your comments, your thoughts, questions.
Yeah. You can ask me anything, by the way. I'm open to whatever. Not
I think it's just scripted.
Not sure if anyone has any.
Too scripted. What she said.
no?
Yeah, we're just, I guess, giving people a moment to absorb and see if there's anything anybody wants to share.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's the kind of thing that when you're doing this kind of work, like when you're connecting with people in this way, you just, like, until you start doing it, it's like, and when you're doing it in earnest and asking really tough questions, it's hard. Until you're actually doing it, it can feel really like, oh, it just seems into. But it's not always when you're doing it. It can feel like, yeah, it can just feel like a list of questions sometimes. Connecting can be really challenging for sure.
Some of this may be quite new for people as well. I mean, I'm sure many people are texting and chatting, you know, online, but in the context of providing a counseling session, I think that's still relatively new for a lot of people. So.
In my opinion, for you to like connect with the youth, it has to be like less structured. Because right now it's more like it's a scripted conversation. Like if I was a youth in help, I called, I would want to connect with somebody who understands me.
Oh, we're just gonna make sure people can hear you, right?
I would want to connect with somebody who understands me, even though they're in a professional field. You know.
Right. Yeah.
Not like a scripted conversation. Like you have the question, I have the answer, like back and forth. It has to be more fluid.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
And
definitely.
how would you kind of, any suggestions in terms of how to make it fluid? Like how do you think?
Well, depending on the situation, like to build the trust, you have to like build a relationship. You know, like talk, unquote, unquote, even though there's like professional. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you.
Definitely. Yeah.
Were you able to catch that, Gayle?
I think, Bill, for me, and this is true of like most most of the counseling I do. Sorry?
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Can I ask you one question, Gayle?
Hi.
Yeah,
sure.
I'm just wondering that you said that you experienced kind of disengagement from the youth when you were talking in the mobile, like, this online setting. Is there any kind of situations that you change the platform from, online to the phone, because you failed to, get back the engagement of youth? I'm just wondering.
Right, so that I would ask them to change the platform?
Yeah, have you ever changed the platform?
It was sometimes, you're right, it can just be technology based, and in those I couldn't, it wasn't something that we could do here, but if you could, then that would be helpful. Yeah, like if it's a way that there's lots of technological things that will come up for sure, and if they're able to address those, then yeah, and answer it that way, that's great.
Yeah.
So I guess, so the question, I think if I understood the question, so the question was, like, if you start a counseling session online, and if there are some issues, let's say through a live chat, and there are some ruptures or issues that occur, and they're not necessarily technically related, would you then move towards a different platform like the phone? Would you ask the client to put on the phone? Is that something that you guys would normally do? It's an interesting question.
I think if you have the capacity for that, absolutely. Like, I think if that's going to be something, because I think what often happens with some of our people who connect with us first online is that then they want to connect on the phone after that. So they want to sort of test the waters and see what's going on and what we're about. And then they're like, okay, now I want to call. So that's cool. Absolutely. The only problem with, and this is just a particular, the only problem with that currently here is that we just don't have the capacity. Like, we don't have, if the people who are here on calls are already on the phone, so we just don't have enough counselors to be able to do that. So they can call back and talk to someone, but yeah, for sure, I think that's something that we often experience, is that sort of intro online, and then moving toward more connect on the phone.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, that clarifies it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that sort of highlights the importance of giving young people a range of different ways through which they can connect, because some people may feel more comfortable to connect initially through an online chat. Others may be okay with the phone call, and others might be just fine with making a first contact in person. So the more sort of ways through which people have a chance to connect with mental health workers, I think the better, because we'll be able to sort of cover more people who are looking for help and need help. Thank you for that question. That was very very interesting. Any other questions, comments that people have or want to share?
If people are also moving from being in person, like say you've met someone in person once or had that meeting initially, the work after that online is often easier because they know you a little bit, they've got a sense of like who you are, what you're about. So I do find that having some of that initial contact can certainly be helpful into moving into online work. That can definitely be, if there's an opportunity for that, that's great. And it's not to say you can't get there without meeting in person, because I think there's lots of great ways. Like, the other thing is that I know people are also doing a lot of counseling now on Skype, right? Like so that you can actually see someone now. So you do, again, get that body language and that sort of connection as well. So there's definitely lots of new and innovative ways of connecting that just come with challenges, right? It just comes with different things to consider and things to think about each time we sort of engage with people in a different way.
So that's helpful because I think that reminds us about, like, it's not a this or that. It could be this sometimes and that other times, depending on the situation for that young person.
Definitely.
And that's good. I think it's important. I kind of course, I want to emphasize that because I think it's important that we think about integrated models of care so that people have access to services through online mechanisms as well as in person.
Right.
Any other comments, questions, people? Yes, we have one here in the room.
Hi,
from
this is Chantal. I work at Central Office and at the DPAJ site and with the National Youth Council, and it was really helpful to hear your concrete tips on how to be transparent. I actually loved the bracketing idea. I'm a very nonverbal person, so I find that texting, I always kind of go back on that. So it was great encouragement to hear, oh, this could work for you if it's part of who you're, like if that's who you are. And balancing being real and genuine and not pretending to know acronyms and lingo that we just can't keep up with, and using that as a point to really develop a relationship or a community, right? So I really thought it was concrete, and I'm going to take away those 3 S's, simple, succinct, and sincere. I think we can apply that to many, like all the ways that we communicate and meet with people in the world of today. So being simple communication, sincere communication, and succinct communication. I really love that. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And most of it came from like trial and error.
Right.
You know, there wasn't a lot of, I mean, there's a bit more research now, but still not that much. Like there's still not that much research about like, doing therapy online or doing things in a digital way. So a lot of it was just ways that we found through trial and error of working with people that sort of often we found were sort of getting us into trouble.
Well, and I think emphasizing being transparent, like when we talk about Access values, being transparent, I think, is a great way to put those values to work, right? And respecting the person who you're working with and really allowing for them to get to know your intentions and testing you out. Like we're hearing that this might be a way to test you out and see if it's a good fit. So I found it very encouraging.
Yeah, and that's fair, right? Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, I think I mean, the other thing is that we have now, like now that the counseling that we do online is like there's more young people reaching out to us online than on the phones, and the counseling sessions are very productive, I will say, if that makes sense. Like they're successful sessions. People are able to connect and really work through things and do that. So it's very encouraging. So I think as counselors, we were all sort of worried, like, is this okay? Like, should we be doing this? Is this really counseling? Is this what we're doing? And I think it is.
Hi, can I ask another question? I'm just wondering, I know that there is a phone line that you can ask help for the suicidal thoughts and really immediate, attentions required situations. And I'm wondering how the online platform can provide the kind of really, high risk youth individuals. Yeah, that would be great to answer.
Yeah. I think it depends on the agency they're reaching out to. So if people are really at high risk, it's still always, we have a couple of different services. If you can trace the call, if someone's at risk, their call would be traced or their chat would still be traced. We would still be calling 911 if somebody was at risk, right? At Kids Cell Phone, it's a little different because it's an anonymous phone line and it's an anonymous chat service. So unless people give us the information about where they are, we don't have a duty to report. So it creates a safe conversation for us. But our texting service is not anonymous. So if they're having conversations and someone is at high risk, they will be calling 911. Yeah. So they would sort of remain in contact with the person, and then their supervisor or someone around them would be calling 911 and getting that person help.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really helpful. Yeah.
I think what's also important to consider if you're doing this work and you do have information about where people are at and you know their identifying information, your duty to report could easily be triggered in these conversations. So I think it's also something, often what we do is remind people about duty to report and young people, because we want them to make informed decisions and decide about their safety. And so if people are we remind them about our duty to report, right? So if they want us to call an ambulance or they want us to call child protection, we can definitely do that if they give us their identifying information. If you already have that information, it puts you in a different legal position, right? You would have to call 911. If someone wrote you an email and said, I'm suicidal and I'm going to hurt myself, then you knew who and where they were, then you would have a duty to report.
Oh,
so those
great.
duties
Yeah, thank you.
remain the same, even though you're connected. Yeah.
It really helps to online.
Okay, we have another question in the room here.
Hi, I'm Amini. I'm my Tech Lab with Dr. Lal. And one of my questions was surrounding, you touched on a little bit about ending the session and sort of keeping your sessions to around an hour, but I was curious to know, as a counselor or someone, usually you have work hours, and so how does having this online access and this chat access, which usually implies that it's going to garner more of immediate response, how do you still establish that scheduling, and how do you keep your hours sort of more limited to when a youth would contact you?
Right. So we, through great effort is the short answer. It takes a lot of work. Basically, so we're 24 hours, right? So we have counselors starting at different times of the day. So we cover, they overlap, right? So we have people available. Having said that, we have people in queue. Like, we definitely have people waiting to get through. We're always striving really hard to get that number down to 0, but with chat especially, often there's kids waiting in queue and young people waiting. But one of the ways, there's a couple of ways, like we're starting to look at things like, so while they're waiting, they're reminded that they can call and get through on the phone immediately, that's someone they can reach immediately, that they can call 911 if they need help. And then there's also some links out to like things on our website that they can do while they're waiting. So like relaxation things, or like things that they can engage in while they're waiting to talk to somebody. And then there's reminders about safety and things like that. What was does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a little bit different in the kids help phone context, because I know you offer your service 24 hours, but I know that in some other situations or in some other clinicians or counselors, they might not have that luxury of being able to offer their services 24 hours. So any tips or any, I don't know, just any opinions or thoughts on how to maintain a schedule and maintain your practice as well while doing this service?
I think again, transparency and clarity, I think, will go a long way. So that people know what they can choose when, and then sticking to that. So you're not like being like, oh, I'm just going to respond to this today because I'm worried. Like, if you have said like you're responding during these hours, that you stick to that, so that people, those boundaries are upheld. Because otherwise, then definitely if people like it happens to us, say on our social media platforms, like kids will reach out to us and post, questions or counseling concerns on our social media, and that's not a place where we have 24-hour service, right? So we can't respond, and sometimes they could be even like at risk of suicide, and nobody can respond to that immediately, right? So obviously we respond as soon as we can, but we had to make a decision to not start responding to those in the moment, because once we did start responding that way, then the door's open to say like, oh, well, there is someone monitoring, and if I use, if I'm at risk, they will respond to me. So we don't want to create that danger zone. So really sticking to those hours and being clear that, there's maybe different times a day when different people are available, but that it's not, if it's not 24/7, that it's not, and then having other services maybe that are, so that who they can reach out to in the in-between times.
Perfect, thank you. Great. So we'll maybe check one last time online or on the phone. Anybody else have any questions, comments? to share before we bring the webinar to a close? Last chance. We still have a few minutes. Anybody in the room? Last chance. Okay, going once, going twice, going 3 times. And it looks like we're going to close the webinar. So I'd like to just end by saying thank you very much to Gayle and to Kids Health Phone for this great presentation. For those of you who have attended today, we hope that you found this webinar to be helpful. And if you know of someone who could benefit from this webinar, feel free to let them know that the webinar will be recorded, or has been recorded at this point, and will be available through the Access Open Minds website shortly. And if you do have some feedback for us that we could keep in mind for future webinars, feel free to reach out. And finally, thank you very much, everybody, and take good care.